Welcome back to Unveiling the Covenants. We are talking about the Ten Commandments today. So by this point, Moses has led the Israelites to the foot of Mount Sinai. We're seeing a covenant event take place. And now in Exodus 20, we get the narrative of the Ten Commandments. I'm going to start moving really fast through the next few chapters because the rest of these chapters will have to do with the law of the covenant. And so we need to talk about what that means. When two people enter into covenant and they vow an exchange of lives with each other, the most important thing to understand is that this sharing of life, this bond, is not without regulations and rules. And the rules connote a complete exclusive gift of self to the other and vice versa. And that includes in every facet of their life. So your finances, your body even, but also your work, your time, all of these become completely the other's. In that bond, rules govern the relationship. For example, marriage, as I've used as an example before, you are bound by the laws of marriage being free and total and faithful and fruitful, which are the categories that Pope Paul VI in Humanae Vitae detailed. And so when you look at the Ten Commandments, that's what you need to understand. And then all the following laws that come from the mouth of God determine how the covenant code of Israel is supposed to function. So I'm going to establish this in this way. When you take a look at the Ten Commandments, you need to look at two different aspects. We all know this, the first three and the last seven. But what I do want to mention to you is that it's actually the first three, the fourth, and the last six. And we'll talk about that. The first three are what's known as essentially universal law. This is the law that's written upon the heart of man because all man is made for the worship of God. Even if a man is an atheist, the truth is he is made for the worship of God. He is made to contemplate the metaphysical, the eternal, the transcendent. And so even the atheist longs for an absolute authority. And that's why an atheist would look at murder and say that's evil. They can't tell you why other than, well, there seems to be some kind of a societal standard. But then you ask him what judges that standard, he'll say civil law. What judges civil law? He can't answer you. What if civil law changes? He can't answer that either. And so what this tells you is that even the atheist, even the non-believer, holds a kind of necessity of belief in a transcendent source of truth and goodness, and that's God. And so the first three laws correspond to that reality, including the law of the Sabbath. Keeping holy the Sabbath day has little to do with it has something to do with the rest from work. Man needs to rest. But the rest is not so that man can become a vegetable for that day and essentially have complete check out in terms of rest. No, that is the day for leisure. That is the day for participation in the divine life. And so man actually engages in his most important work on the day of rest, which is worship. And so leisure culminates in worship. And leisure actually is a kind of work. Man has to put in effort to have leisure. If you don't believe me, tear yourself away from the work of your day to go lie down in the grass and contemplate the universe. That's a work of leisure. It's work. Or stop whatever work you're doing, find some time to write poetry today. That's work. Leisure is a kind of work that we engage in. And so even on the day of rest, we are called to engage in work that recreates the divine life in the soul. Those are the first three commandments, the eternal law inscribed in human hearts. Commandment 4 to 10 speak about the natural law. And this is the law that's inscribed in every human heart as well. We understand these at the natural level. Reason shows us that these are the good things to do. They are the sacrificial things to do. And they are the virtuous things to do. And so it is only a society that overthinks or thinks out of it that forces itself out of the natural law. But the truth is, when man is left to his own devices and virtue is the pursuit of a society, these 7 laws become the ruling force of that society. And so the fourth one, as I mentioned before, it's 1, 2, 3. You've got the fourth, and then it is 5 to 10. And you might be looking at me thinking, well, really, what's going on here? That fourth commandment is what's known as a bridge commandment or a hinge commandment. And it's typical in covenant, the writing out of covenant codes and covenant laws. So as you think about the ones that don't directly pertain to God, 5 to 10 especially, those are called covenant codes because they govern how society ought to function in virtue. The fourth one is both divine and human. This is not to say that parents immediately become divine beings. That's nonsense. And unfortunately, I've been in societies where, especially because of Eastern philosophy or just parental abuse, that parents establish themselves as figures of divine governance in their children's lives, even to the point of complete dictation of everything they do, when they do it, how they do it. And so they identify as the gods of their children's lives. That's ugly, that's perverse, that's evil, and that's wrong. What does the fourth commandment demand? Well, glorify your father and your mother, honor your father and your mother, that it may go well with you in the land. In fact, I want to read it out. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land which the Lord gives you. It is the only commandment out of all the 10 that carries with it a promise, because it is contingent upon a society that's flourishing to honor the parents that have come before them. But it's not just about biological parents. This language of father and mother, okay, first of all, let's talk about honor first of all. The Hebrew word kabod, glorify, it doesn't just mean to respect. It doesn't just mean to honor. To glorify your parents means to seek the will of God for your life such that it is a glory to your parents. And so parents are glorified by children who honor the ways of the Lord. And so it's incumbent upon parents to enforce the ways of the Lord upon the lives of their children from a young age. Because teach them the way they should walk in the way of the Lord, and in their older years they shall never depart. That's from the Proverbs directly. And so that is the responsibility of parents, more than anything. More than giving you a good education for the sake of a job, more than getting you married off, it is honoring the Lord that is the primary responsibility of parenthood. And if parents honor that, then they have glorified their children. And so the children's life in God becomes a glory to their parents. That's what the commandment really means. But because of that, honor your father and your mother. The language of father and mother for the Hebrew people was more than your biological relationships. The language of father and mother had to do with the authority that's placed in your life. And that's why I always preach within the language of covenant theology that people who are placed in authority over you have a kind of spiritual fatherhood and motherhood over you. We've lost that sense in the public sphere. No one looks at the president today and thinks, yes, that's my spiritual father. That's my political father. No one looks at our elected officials and thinks, spiritual father, spiritual mother, I can look up to you, I can honor you. No one thinks that way anymore. And we ought to reclaim that language, because that language is crucial. If we can reclaim it, then we can see that God's plan for the society hinges upon human beings honoring legitimate authority in glory. And the glory is the glory of God. And so the way we honor their authority is by means of what aligns with the will of God, so that we can question the authority when that which they're calling us to does not align with the will of God. And so I say this to parents. Children have a right to question their parents if their parents are living in an immoral manner. Children have a right to call parents to moral accountability by virtue of this commandment. This commandment means glorify your father and your mother, glorify those in authority to the extent that it aligns with the will of God, because that's what kabod entails. It is the glory of God that you're giving. It is not the glory of man that you're giving. And so the child's role in your life, parents, I want to say this in caution. The child's role in our life is not to vicariously fulfill all of our desires as parents. That is wrong. That is evil. That is perverse. The child's role is to seek out the will of the Lord. The role of the parent is to teach the child to love the Lord and to discern his will. Nothing else is more important than teaching the child to be holy and saintly and to discern the will of the Lord. Anything that deviates from that is a violation of the fourth commandment. On both sides, for father and for mother, for child and for parents. And so this is something we ought to think about wisely. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land which the Lord gives you. Because if we live in a society that is glorifying the will of God, children honor the gift of parents to the degree that it is aligning with the will of God, because parents have lived in a manner that glorifies God. And because of that, precisely because of that, children now have created a society, they grow up into adulthood, they create a society that continues the glorification of God. And that includes the care for parents in their old age, which is something the scriptures will constantly speak about, by the way. The scriptures are actually abundantly clear. Multiple times throughout the wisdom books will this honoring of parents come about, and it's always in the connotation of the following of the will of God. If we can understand that rightly, then a lot of the issues in our society can be curtailed and solved. And so parents, know this well. You're a bad parent if you enable all the desires of your children. You're a bad parent if you give your children whatever they want, whenever they want. In fact, we all implicitly know this. We are good parents if we question our children and constantly call them out to moral accountability and holiness, and therefore the pursuit of the will of God. And then we train our children to do the same for themselves, for others, and even for us. And that is how the family is supposed to function within the covenantal framework. And so from there, we go on to you shall not kill. Because the the killing is the taking the life of the innocent. It is, and so there's a distinction here between murder and accidental killing. And I want to be very clear that accidental killing or just killing is not condemned in the scriptures. I need to be abundantly clear here. And so, yes, that brings up the question of the death penalty. And despite the fact that Pope Francis changed the catechism paragraph, I want to make this clear. It doesn't change church doctrine. What Pope Francis did was the expression of what's called a prudential judgment, because the formal doctrine of the church remains unchanged, that the death penalty as enshrined in scripture is a right of the state to practice for the sake of the preservation of the state from continued perpetuated evil. And that's a natural law reality as well as a divinely revealed law reality. And so when John Paul II, and then Francis, of course, elevated it to such a high demand, one of the things that we need to consider in that paragraph in the Catechism is that it is a demand that is lofty and it cannot be met by nations where the proper means of rehabilitation and incarceration is not ideal, for want of a better term. What do I mean by this? I lived in the Philippines, I lived in India, I was a missionary there in both countries. Now, Malaysia and Singapore are developed nations, and so the prison systems are very well regulated, just like here in the US. But when you look at India and the Philippines, for example, or even Mauritius, these are nations that are categorically classified as third world. And there are some ways in which some areas are developed, but for the most part, the nations are largely not. Then what do you expect of the prison systems? Well, very low security. There is security, to be sure, but it's very low. And so vicious murderers can, in fact, find creative ways to get out of prison. And so the death penalty becomes a true, legitimate moral recourse. Now, that's just one example. The other example is someone breaks into your home, threatens your life and the life of your children and your bride. Well, you have an obligation, actually, a moral obligation, to bring to cessation the moral evil that they want to commit upon you. In the process of doing so, if you end their life, it's an application of what the church calls the principle of double effect. Your cessation of that evil act brought about the end of their life, but your intent wasn't willful murder. You didn't plan murder. And that's a biblically Christian position to hold. And so when the scripture talks about the Hebrew word here for you shall not murder, it is willful murder of, in this case, the innocent, for the most part, no prompted reason, or for a premeditated reason, for vengeance, for example. In all of those situations, that's a violation of the law of life. Now, some people might say, well, you can't be pro-life if you're pro-death penalty. Actually, that's not true. Even the scriptures would attest that that's not true. Because the one who has willfully committed murder, the one who has demonstrated that they are a threat to the common good of society and therefore the robbing of the life of people, they have, by means of their action, forfeited certain social rights. And you might say, that sounds harsh. No, that's not harsh at all. We all understand this. Parents, whenever children violate curfew, well, what do? They have forfeited the right of freedom of travel or freedom of activity, and so parents ground them. That's one example. Or if a child has demonstrated that they're conducting themselves in an immoral manner in one way, parents come up with proportionate punishments that essentially deny the rights for other things, because by means of the action we have denied ourselves certain rights. We understand that that's a moral ramification. Murder is no different. Understand that well. So when we read these commandments, understand that what the church is calling us to is a just, proportionate understanding of how society ought to function. It's not about niceness. And so if you think that the Ten Commandments call us to be kind and love one another by a nice definition, I'm sorry, but you need to read a different Bible. You need to read a Bible that's not from Christianity. If you're reading the scriptures as the scriptures, you will see that the language is harsh and clear. Why? Because it is a loving Father who provides covenant laws in this way for the sake of the good of his children. Parents understand this well. We take our children to the doctor and, sometimes they have to take medication or sometimes they have to get their blood drawn. My 3-year-old recently was taken in for a blood draw as part of an annual physical. And it pains us as parents to watch that needle go into her arm. And frankly, I know that's true for everyone. But it has to be done. And so we allow painful things to happen to our children for their good. There are certain good things that come about by a painful way. That's what God is doing here. That some of the laws are painful but good. And that's what we are called to adhere to. And so you shall not commit adultery because of the exclusivity of marriage. The bond between one man, one woman, permanent, lifelong, and indissoluble, doesn't allow for the divorce and remarriage, no matter how many people speculate that this is something that the church ought to allow. It doesn't allow for abject adultery, like a man sleeping with another woman, a woman sleeping with another man outside of marriage. That the church explicitly disallows it because it's a violation of natural law and divinely revealed law. And so to that end, everything that violates that intrinsic union becomes a problem. You shall not steal because private property ownership is a good thing. The stealing of private property connotes a harm to the moral law in society. Yes, you heard me right. And so any form of a progressivist notion that argues that, if you're in a certain society or a certain subgroup in society, those crimes are justified. They're committing these crimes. Well, no, that's garbage, especially in free nations where there are structures allowed for even poor people to have a true working relationship, a working environment, a working life and activity that contributes to the common good. In those situations, theft doesn't become something that's allowed. The only areas where you can have a sort of application of a principle here has to do with in a tyrannical, despotic situation where outside of theft, the person is going to actually starve to death. So death is on the line here. Then at this point, the church teaches that the abject poor have a claim to the wealth of others. And that's why free nations don't have this problem. Developed nations don't have this problem. I've seen this problem, by the way. I've seen it in the Philippines. I've seen people who literally scrounge in trash for their food. Our situation is not like that. Developed nations don't have that problem. Especially nations that have welfare states, they don't have that problem. We have systems in place. And so in no circumstance when basic needs are met, and so death is not on the line in terms of absolute necessity, in terms of eating, for example. When those needs are met, then no, theft becomes a moral evil regardless of the situation. And then you shall not bear false witness because objectively speaking, this is the governance of a good society, that every individual must be at the pursuit of truth and truth at all times so that the society can flourish in light of objective truth. A lot of the societal evils we are seeing right now, by the way, all of these are what you call political laws. I'm not even kidding. Covenant codes are political laws. They are laws that govern the polis. They govern the political life, the societal political life of individuals. And so the bearing of false witness means that individuals have an obligation to pursue truth and form our intellects in truth. And so a lot of the societal political breakdown that we're seeing in the West right now and in the world has been the result of individuals who don't seek out truth. And especially if narratives that seem to be kind or nice, these are narratives that touch on guilt, whether it's guilt of affluence or guilt of a particular race, what have you, whatever the narratives are. I don't want to specify. Those narratives have more of a Marxist appeal than a biblical appeal, and we need to be cautious about it because the biblical truth tends to be harsh and clear. The biblical truth tends to be charitable, and charity tends to call people to truth and conversion and repentance and an ordering of life in virtue that is sometimes difficult. And so this bearing of false witness has to do, the law against bearing of false witness has to do with calling the entire society to seek truth always, so that truth may reign in the land. Even if you don't believe in God, this is still a natural law reality. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, which again is a condemnation of not just abject theft of private property, but now it's on a larger scale. Your neighbor's house. And now the way it's written, your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, his manservant, maidservant, his ox or donkey, anything that is your neighbor's. Because the point here is, if in small ways theft is not allowed, in larger ways theft is not allowed. Which brings us to the final one. You shall not covet your neighbor's bride and then your neighbor's goods. Because again, it is a condemnation on any form of adultery, and it's a condemnation on any form of the theft of private property. Because one of the marks of a free people is the ownership, stewardship, innovation, and development and enterprise of private property. That's right here. And as you've heard this, mind you, none of this is me squirreling what the text is saying. This is actually in the text. It's in the Hebrew. But I also want to challenge you, if you don't believe me, go and look up what the rabbis have to say about this. Go in, and I'm not talking about modern rabbis alone. I'm also talking about the commentators, the Mishnah, people who wrote the Mishnah. That's commentaries on the Torah, commentaries on the first 5 books of the Bible. But if you want to take it a step further, also look at the church fathers and how they talk about private property ownership. Because Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII, was abundantly clear that this is a key part of man's co-creative stewardship call by God. And so the Ten Commandments are meant to preserve man's liturgical religious relationship and man's societal political relationship. Because in the Ten Commandments becomes the perfect expression of what a man ought to look like in terms of his conduct with God and man, and therefore in church and society, therefore in marriage and in family, therefore in individual and in the polis. And if you understand all of that well, then you understand very clearly that the expansion of the knowledge of the Ten Commandments is one of the things that will actually restore balance. It'll restore order to a society that's otherwise fragmented. And so this is my challenge to all of us, that we read the Ten Commandments, teach our children the Ten Commandments, and understand what they all entail. And by the way, it's not just me who's saying this. Catechism 2197 to 2220. The church in the Catechism talks, this is particularly about the fourth commandment. The church is very explicit that those commandments have very explicit appeals to authority, to governance, to glorifying God and God's will. And if we get that right, if we get the bridge commandment right, then our children will grow up to pursue God, mostly by our model and our beckoning. And by the way, be strict and firm about it. Please don't tell yourself things to the effect, well, we inducted them into this. We say the word encounter with Jesus Christ so frivolously, and we very often mean emotional encounters. My friends, it is not enough. The next generation is rising up, and they are a generation who are hungry for studied truth more than ever before. And so it is incumbent upon us who are believers of the truth to have greater capacities of dialoguing the truth so that we can boldly walk into the public sphere and onto the lives of our children and present that truth systematically. And sometimes it involves defeating arguments for the sake of drawing them into the fullness of life in Christ and His church, and therefore in flourishing society. When you understand all of this, then you can see that the Ten Commandments ends with these words. They said to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will hear. But let not God speak to us, lest we die." And Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you." Because part of a covenant bond is the testing of the fidelity of the bond. And that the fear of Him may be before your eyes, that you may not sin. And God gives Moses laws about sacrifice immediately after that. Because the Ten Commandments, as a covenantal compact, define how man ought to worship God. And so the laws about sacrifice immediately follow. Because you cannot have covenant if you don't have blood sacrifice. And that's true even for marriage, by the way. Not just in terms of the first time bride and bridegroom come together and there's actually blood that's been shed, but even in the small and great ways. Husband is working on the house, and as he's hammering a nail, he accidentally hammers his thumb and blood is shed. We think of those as accidents, and they're often greeted with expletives. But all of those things in small and great ways is blood shed for the covenant. Or the caring of your children, and in the process, the falling, the scraping, the bruising that parents encounter, that's blood shed for the covenant. The cooking of meals, the cutting of your finger, in small and great ways, that's blood shed for the covenant. We don't think of it that way. But when we enwrap everything in the language of covenant, that's where sacrifice comes into play. Because the giving of ourselves is meant to all the way elevate itself back and be subsumed into the liturgical giving of Christ upon the altar. And that's why when we have covenant laws, immediately after that, we see that worship by sacrifice is established. You'll see this every single time. And in the new and eternal covenant, as Christ establishes the new and eternal covenant, He says, "This is the new covenant in my blood," in Luke 22. What does He immediately do after that? He establishes the Eucharist, and then He sacrifices Himself on the cross. And that call is meant to be emulated by all of us. And so the people stood far off. Moses drew near to the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to the people of Israel, you've seen for yourself that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make yourself gods of gold." First time in history, by the way, in the history of anthropology, that a religious system of worship demands no graven images to the God, in this case Yahweh, because the people were making, throughout anthropology, idols that they recognize, either demonically looking human beings or anthropomorphic beings, or animals that they were worshiping. God said, enough's enough, put a stop to it. Because one day Jesus will come. And as the book of Galatians tells us, as the Catechism tells us, as Christian tradition tells us, as John tells us in the prologue, He is the image of the invisible God. And because of that, we now have a graven image that we can look to as the face of God, because he is the visible image of the invisible God. And because of that, looking upon his face is to look upon the face of God. Looking upon his Eucharist is to gaze the face of our Father. And that's why the Christian revelation is so perfect in its fulfillment in Christ. And so then God says, an altar of earth you shall make for me, and offer your burnt offerings and your peace offerings. In other words, your blood sacrifice for forgiveness and your thanksgiving offerings. Where I cause my name to be remembered, anamnesis, or zakher, it means liturgical remembrance and sacrifice, and I will come to you and bless you. So you have covenant, you have blood sacrifice, you have worship, and then you've got the blessings. That's the hierarchy here. Man willingly enters into covenant with God and with each other. You have blood sacrifice that's established after. Blood sacrifice culminates in liturgical worship. Liturgical worship releases blessings, unleashes blessings upon mankind. Reverse that in any order, and you essentially unleash curses upon us. And you shall, and then it speaks to particular liturgical laws for the sake of the priests, which Leviticus will actually enumerate in greater detail. But from this point on, I'm going to skip a little fast through the laws so that we can get to the story of the blood of the covenant sacrifice. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter.